Hello and welcome to the Auditing Antics podcast. So, before we get started today, Michelle, I wanted to talk a little bit about the advent that I have going
Yes.
on social media. For those that don't know, Michelle and I love anything Advent related. She does
Mhm.
a lot of Advents for nephews and nieces. And her and I actually have mine right here. We're going to be doing the Christmas Myrtle this year. So, and we always pick some kind of book, usually not a romance, usually a thriller that is an Advent book, which is pretty fun.
Mhm.
Kindle Unlimited has a lot of those. So check that out if you like that. But I have on a lot on LinkedIn, but on a lot of the social media platforms as well, I started to do a work related, more so Advent, just to try to break up the month of December. Everything gets really crazy trying to work towards the end of the year. So just something a little fun because apparently every part of my life needs an Advent in December.
Oh, right.
Now, Michelle, we're going to be talking about data analyzed today with E&M services. And I know this is something that we both have frustrations with when
Mhm.
we see it inside of audits, because there's a lot of misunderstanding. Even when we are doing an audit of not only a physician, for example, but also a coder, we see the same issues coming up. So it's something that, there's still a lot of misunderstanding around that we
Mhm.
really need to clarify to hopefully get some more of the word out there about how we need to be looking at this inside of documentation.
Yeah. I think the one thing that is really important to realize when it comes to crediting data analyzed is that you cannot just take what's in the note at face value. There's a little bit more validation that has to go into crediting data analyzed, and we're going to get into those things today. But if you're just going through a note and saying, okay, 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 you have to really take it a step further to know that it should actually be credited in this encounter, um, even if it appears like it should be. um,
Mhm.
so that I would say is the first, big thing about data analyzed. Don't just take it at face value.
Yeah. And one thing I think a lot of people do not realize is that we have this section within the guidelines. I have it up on another screen right now. And if you remember, when we look at that second element or column of our MDM grid, it talks about the amount and or complexity of data to be reviewed and analyzed. And
Hmm.
we forget that this isn't review or analyze, it's the word and. So it
Hmm.
becomes really important to look at the definition from AMA about analyzing. And one thing that really helps me is when I think about this, it's not just checking a box. It's
Hmm.
not that the provider said, I reviewed all of these labs, check the box, renew medication, move on. The
Hmm.
question really becomes, okay, how was that a part of the encounter that day? What do you
Yeah.
have going on that you had to look at those lab values? Are you monitoring sometimes the toxicity of a patient that way? The efficacy of medication is monitored that way quite a bit as well. So, what is it that is going on that is driving the need to look at that data, that information?
Yeah. So let me read the definition of
Okay.
analyzed that AMA has in the guidelines. Now, mind you, once again, revisiting elementary school anxiety, I did not read this prior. Well, I've read it before, but not immediately before. Says analyzed the process of using the data as part of the MDM. The data element itself may not be subject to analysis, example glucose, but it is instead included in the thought process for diagnosis, evaluation, or treatment. So you need to show in your note how this data that you're analyzing is playing into into this thought process. And I think that is usually the number one missing element. And where I see it most present is in the EMRs that allow the provider to pull in the most recent lab and imaging data.
Mhm.
So we go in the note, and there's this huge laundry list. I mean, I know you've seen it, I've seen it, we've all seen it, of, my favorite is since last visit, or, whatever.
Mhm.
Um, and you've got labs in there from 2017. It's like, what is the purpose of this, and why was this lab from 2017 relevant today in 2025? Just out of curiosity. But it's not just about that lab value being present in the note, like you said, or having a catchphrase saying that you've reviewed all. I've seen this one, this is my favorite: I've reviewed all available imaging labs and
Yeah.
previous documentation. Well, gee, that should be a whole lot of prolonged services billed.
Mhm.
If that's the case, like, we have to really think about what these little catchphrases actually mean. But it's not just about the values being present and you saying you reviewed them. You need to show how you used that to make your decisions, or to even diagnose the patient, things like that. How is that involved in your thought process? And we never see, very rarely do we see that documented.
And I think a lot of the issues there is that, we've talked in the past before about how with EMR systems, for example, a lot of times they are focusing more on the clinical side, clinical workflow, things like that.
Hmm.
So they may have options available to pull that information in, but then it's completely misunderstood by providers and whoever else that think that you can then use that same section towards coding and billing.
Hmm.
And even though documentation is largely used for our side of the industry for
Yes.
documentation, coding, billing, all of that, we have to remember too that there's the other side on the clinical where maybe they don't want to dig in and have to look up the lab values. But where we go south is when people think that the two come together and they mean the same thing, and they don't.
Hmm.
And,
Hmm.
I was just doing an audit this morning actually where I could tell based on the specialty and the level of service that both the physician and the coder chose, I could tell they were thinking about data and that they were giving
Hmm.
credit for like an interpretation, for example. But the problem was is that we could not see the specific information. So it said something along the lines of similar to what you were saying. It would say reviewed the following test, and then there would be a date. But I still didn't have a source, so I didn't know where that was coming from. I didn't know what they were looking at. It was worded as if they were looking at a report, which is
Hmm.
not the same thing as looking at an image or tracing that they're interpreting. So, it really becomes very problematic when we look at it from the coding perspective when people don't
Hmm.
understand what goes into this particular piece.
Yeah, yeah. So, let's just kind of, I know we didn't really have a plan for the direction of, this, because data is something that, like, I really think we could spend hours pulling apart and
Mhm.
giving opinions and having dialogue between coders and auditors and providers, and it still not be something that we all come together cohesively on.
Yeah.
But let's just start with the different elements and quickly talk about, like, our thought process when we're auditing and when we're crediting data analyzed. So I think for you and me both, the order of each unique test is pretty straightforward. But
Mhm.
there are some specialties where it's not as simple as giving them credit because they've ordered tests, and cardiology is one that comes to mind, as well as orthopedics.
Mhm.
So if they're ordering a test, but you also know it's a possibility that they're going to be billing separately for this test, which a lot of times with things like EKGs, echoes, the cardiology diagnostic testing, or like MRIs for orthopedics, the providers end up being the ones doing the actual interpretation.
Mhm.
We can't credit the order of, of that particular test. So while ordering seems pretty straightforward because in, they get credit for that in the encounter with which it's ordered, you still have to apply that other logic of, is this going to be a separately billed procedure? Whether it is billed on that date of service or a different date of service, when it's billed doesn't matter. It just matters that the provider is going to be separately reporting that service.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um,
That's hard externally too. We often can't see that.
no.
And it's something where I always, when I'm going through and discussing this during trainings, for example, it's important for everyone to understand that we have to have key indicators in there to know things like a time frame.
Mhm.
Even based on what you were saying, if we don't know when that test was going to be done, let's say that that person comes back in the future at a follow-up visit and now tries to get credit for that interpretation later, and it's an internal test, that becomes even more complicated because a
Yeah.
lot of times we don't have them giving the identifier showing a date that it was completed, where it was completed, where did they access it. It's just not
Mhm.
a part of what they're used to documenting. So we have this huge deficient area where, unless the system's pulling something in, which depending on the wording we can't use,
Yep.
it makes it that much more difficult.
Yeah, and I think different people view definitions of things differently. So it literally can come down to word choice and
Mhm,
how you choose to to word it in the documentation. And that could be, you very well may be doing an independent interpretation, but you've chosen to say review. That is a very distinct difference in within the elements of medical decision making on how that's credited. So something as simple as word choice could change what's supported. Um,
mhm,
so speaking of review, this is where, in my opinion, review of the results of each unique test, this is kind of where the water really starts to get muddy. And I find oftentimes it's really hard to credit review of tests, whether it's in the
mhm,
office or in the hospital. Because one thing you have to do is you have to go back and make sure the provider didn't get credit for order of that test. So this is where, this is starting to show why I say you just can't take data at face value. You really have to go back and you have to dig deeper into those data elements. And I do think, Stephanie, this is something where auditing is a little bit different than coding. When we are working as auditors, we tend to be digging in deeper, reading between the lines a little bit more, and going those extra steps where a lot of times coding is, you know, obviously quality should always
mhm,
be your top priority, but none of us can deny that quantity is not pressed when it comes to coding. So, how likely do you think it is that a coder is going to be like, oh, I'm going to credit review of these tests. So let me go back and look and see if the provider ordered this at a previous encounter. But the problem with just taking those reviews at face value is I have seen on multiple occasions that result in down coding.
mhm,
When the data analyzed isn't supported, it's the encounter's been upcoded essentially. I kind of said that backwards. So we end up having to downcode it in our audit
mhm,
process. But the review of the results of each unique test, you really have to make sure that that is not something that was ordered at the previous encounter. I know I run into this a lot with like primary care, for example, where they're bringing the patient back in and they document review of, I'm going to say, a CT scan. And when
mhm,
you go back and look, the provider ordered that CT scan at the previous encounter. So they can't get credit for that subsequent review. And that's because when a test is ordered, it is expected that the provider is going to review that test and have a conversation with the patient about it. So that's why we give credit when the test is ordered and not when the test is reviewed, if that makes sense. There is
mhm.
specific verbiage within the guidelines regarding that as well. Um, about counting it as an order instead of a review.
Mhm.
Um, and I'll see if I can
Yeah.
find.
Well, that part basically says that when you're ordering during a face-to-face encounter, you have to give yourself credit for the order.
Yes.
And not only that, but in something like imaging, if that's done internally, you cannot get credit for the order or the review.
Yes.
So that's going to be that double whammy where we definitely don't have it.
Why do we even have this column, darn it?
I know. I absolutely hate this column. It's the worst.
Oh, I tell you, I would say data analyzed is probably like when I get audit rebuttals. Like one
Yeah.
of the number one reason a rebuttal comes through. And because I'm just a naturally anxious person, I'm like, oh gosh, what did I forget? But then I go in and I start seeing this tangled web and I'm like, oh, this is why I didn't account for data analyzed. And I try to do my best to explain that in audit comments, especially like when you said you can tell that's the thought process they were
Mhm.
following in selecting the level of service. I try to very clearly point out why this does not support data analyzed. Um, so moving on to the next is review of prior external notes from each unique source. I think this is one that is also often overcredited because they're not paying attention to the from each unique source. So
Or
hospitalizations, for
not only
example.
that, yeah, I don't even see identifiers to know what they're
True.
looking at most of the
Yeah.
time. So they'll say, I reviewed previous notes, or I reviewed the prior
Mhm.
hospitalization or the ER
Yeah.
visit, but we don't know a time frame. The only time I will say that I've been able to actually give credit in this area is when I'm dealing with a new patient in the outpatient setting, like in the office setting, and they're bringing in documentation,
Mhm.
and that physician does a good job saying, patient brought such and such from their PCP reviewed today.
Yeah.
And that, yes, we have
But
enough, we've got
that's
a source.
one unique source.
Yes,
Not
yes,
every individual little element of what was reviewed. That is
yes.
one unique source. So this also isn't just straightforward, and it's, you can't just say, like you said, I reviewed XYZ. Okay, why did you review it? Um, that's fantastic. And
Well, and to your point in Epic, or in an EMR, I just think of Epic because in the hospital situation you were talking about, they're going to review that inside of the EMR. That would be one source. So it doesn't
yes.
matter even if they did give us identifiers, but I never see those identifiers.
No.
And, we don't know who documented it initially. Was it someone, inside of their department as a different specialist? Very rarely we'll get some information, but not enough to be looking and giving credit for that.
I have to laugh because clearly they're getting insight into what's going on inside my mind when
Yeah.
I am auditing, like, just this is great.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
So
and
happy
another
for you.
thing that I think is important to realize too is that sometimes as coders, they will, and I say they because we act as auditors most of the time, but
Mhm.
or perform work, I should say. We don't act. But when we're looking at the work of a coder, there's also times where they'll be looking in a system and giving credit from like an order module that isn't even a part of the final version of the document.
Mhm. Yeah.
So if you can only see something up in the upper right corner of Epic, and that doesn't make it into the final version of the note, that's going to be a problem because we
Mhm.
can't go outside on the provider side of coding. We can't go outside of our practitioner's progress note unless they lead us there. So if they
Mhm.
say labs ordered or follow up with a blood draw or whatever it may be, if they don't give us those specifics of what they're ordering or reviewing or interpreting, whatever it may be, we also cannot default to other parts of that system
Mm-mm.
to figure it out for them.
And I see this a lot in Epic, where like you said, the orders appear on the top right hand of the screen, but then when we look at the actual documentation, there's nothing. I mean, I've had where there's been not even so much as like the order pulled in
Yeah.
with the diagnosis, you know how we'll do that. It won't even have that or any mention of what or why they ordered
Hmm.
these tests. And that to me is a little, concerning from the perspective of sort supporting medical necessity for the
Right.
testing that's ordered. So I always try to watch out for that. And I know that's an area where I usually like to leave some feedback when um, you know, when you can tell they're crediting those things. Prescription drug management is another one that in Epic is in that sidebar that doesn't always get carried into the note. And if an outside auditor cannot see it,
Hmm.
they aren't going to give credit for it. And that's something to keep in mind, that while these features are very convenient and helpful and nice, I notice it too with the MAR in Epic. That needs to be shown in your note. If
Hmm.
it's printed out, it's unlikely that you're going to give full access to your system to an outside auditor. For a payer, for example, you're likely going to send them copies of the notes, and that's something to keep in mind when you're documenting, is this supported in the
Hmm.
note.
Well,
uh,
and I want to go back really quick to what you were saying with the ordering and review of the test and whether or not that's internal,
mhm.
because I just had a thought here, and one of the things that I've been seeing on external audits that I'm having to help come in and defend against is that the external auditors are looking at claims data and more specifically
Hmm.
on the CMS side of things. So, with some of the UPIC audits that I've been a part of, for example, they are going in and in their denial language, they are saying, we know that such and such occurred because we looked at your claims history. And in some
Whoa.
situations, it wasn't related to testing, but in this one situation, they were bringing up something that had happened a year prior to the date of service that was being audited, because they could see from the data of what was billed previously or around a date, even. And, it makes me think about this data situation because they could easily look that up. It's not like they don't piece it together
Mhm.
eventually. And, we know that the systems are getting more sophisticated with
Mhm.
technology. So they would be able to, analyze, like, I don't know if it's a dashboard of information or what, but we all know they have it. And I'm starting to see that being done in UPIC audits.
Very interesting. That's a
Little
good point.
frightening.
Like, yeah,
I mean, we
that's a
we
really good
shouldn't be
point.
doing it anyways, but to the
No.
point that people again like to bury their head in the sand, don't think that compliance is something that needs to be prioritized. We know
Mhm.
that we have a lot of practices and organizations that do not prioritize annual audits, things like that, or they
Mhm.
do them and they want to push back. They don't want to listen to the external auditor.
Yeah, I get
All
that.
of these things, it's like the opportunity to continue that behavior is continuing to lessen.
Yes.
As much as people want to wait, they can wait to get that outside input, but it's going to catch up with you one way or another,
Mhm.
because this is happening in small practices, this is happening in large organizations.
Mhm.
It's not really a matter of how big you are in the pool of the
Yep.
industry, it's what your information looks like individually.
Yeah, and with their use of AI and stuff, it no longer matters how big the pool is. You will not hide.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
it's just something to keep in mind. And like you said, if you're getting an outside audit from the organization perspective, use that data not only to see how well your providers or coders are doing, but take that time to also evaluate your internal policies and see if there needs to be updates. Do you need to go back and refresh yourself on what your payers are saying or what your MAC is saying, and possibly update or, shore up some gray areas of those policies and make some hard and fast decisions for your organization in areas that are gray,
Mhm,
for the coding guidelines, especially if you have an auditor who is giving you really good feedback, giving sources and things like that. And they're not just, I mean, I know that it's out there where people will do audits and they give results based on opinions,
mhm,
for example. I mean, coding is very subjective, so there is some of that interpretation that goes on. But if you're getting results that differ from what align with your coding policies, maybe you should take that opportunity to speak with, the outside auditor, and just hear their perspective, their rationale, and try to come to a decision if there needs to be updates within your organization.
mhm. And that feedback needs to be taken into the coding process as well,
Yes. Yes.
because the coder should not be doing what they know is happening if they don't see it in the documentation.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's why external auditing is so helpful, because we're coming in without knowing your processes and things like that. And we're auditing based upon the guidelines.
Mhm.
And that will give you a really good indication and view into, that complete objective review
Right.
of your stuff.
Yeah.
So next, moving on to assessment requiring an independent historian. Um,
Yeah,
there's a
this
lot.
we went back and forth on this quite a bit over the years, especially when the guidelines started in pediatrics and all of that. But you know what? At the end of the day, I've simplified it in my own mind where I just have to be able to see who this historian is. Don't
Mhm.
leave it up to assumption. I'm not making assumptions based on age, stability level, condition that the patient has, any of that. Just show me who you were talking to and then make sure that it's clear.
Yes, and the AMA also provided a definition of independent historian as well. If you have not recently gone through and looked at these definitions, I highly recommend that you do. I remember when these came out, there was like so many light bulb moments for me, and it's really worth the read. If you're an auditor, it gives you really good mind frame for, forming your audit comments when you're wanting to include more detail why you're not allowing these things. Um, read the definitions, you will not be sorry, and continue to read them, continue to refresh your memory on what they are.
Mhm.
But I do think independent historian is one that can be very subjective as well. Because, like you said, some might say, oh, this patient is too. Clearly, they can't provide their own history. But then also, you have an 18-year-old who's present with their mother, and an 18-year-old is able to give their own history. They don't need their mother. I mean, granted, when you're 18, maybe you don't even call and make your own doctor's appointment. I still have to hype myself up for that. But, and I'm 40, but my mom will not do that for me anymore. But, at a certain age, your patient is able to give a history and have a dialogue with the provider about why they're there. So that's why, making that assumption and things like that doesn't really always work.
Yeah.
Okay, so on to independent interpretation of a test performed by another provider, um,
I
not
think
separately reported.
Yeah, I think this goes back to a lot of what we've talked about already today, where we have to have identifiers. We need to know what it is that's specific as far as image. Are you looking at an image? Are you looking at a report of somebody else? You have to be looking at that image in order to provide that interpretation. And it's not something where we should see chest x-ray normal. Okay, well,
Hmm.
that doesn't show us. That still doesn't tell us what you were looking at. So,
Yeah.
one way that I describe that when I'm looking for more information to be documented, I will ask the physician typically, what did you visualize as you were going in? And saying that that patient is normal. What structures were you looking at? Give some context to what you were visualizing if you were looking at the actual image or the tracing, and then go from there.
Yes. And I think it's also important to note that it has to be customary that
Mhm.
this test would be independently interpreted, meaning it's not going to include labs.
Right. Yeah,
You know,
not an
that's not
automated result.
you're not going to be, in the lab reviewing the specimen to support that independent interpretation. It needs to be customary that this would be supported. And also there should be an obvious reason, in my opinion, as to of why independent interpretation would be necessary. I know a lot of people. I was working on one today, and I just kept going back and forth. And the provider documented X-ray interpretation. It was dated prior. It didn't tell me where it was from, so I didn't know the source of it. But when looking at their independent interpretation, it says X rays were obtained and showed. So,
Mm, yeah.
are you just putting the report from the X rays taken at the previous date in here? Like, this does not sound like your independent interpretation of the images obtained previously. It
Mhm.
sounds to me like you're just using the template with which the provider who actually interpreted those images were was documented in.
Mhm.
So it's not even just about seeing those buzzwords of independent interpretation. Um, it's you've got to show your interpretation, and it probably shouldn't include contradictory
Mhm.
wording or verbiage such as x-rays were obtained today, or make it look like you just did the x-rays.
Right.
So keep that in mind. It should be free texted. It doesn't have to follow a x-ray interpretation format, but there should be some type of interpretation
Yeah.
documented there, and have some type of substance to it. I have also seen, Stephanie, I have experienced where they will pull in the template will pull in, the imaging report, and then down at the
Oh,
bottom
yeah.
they will say they have independently interpreted this. That does not count because you still only documented the interpretation of the original performing provider. So just
Mhm.
keep those things in mind. Just because you're saying those buzzwords, your documentation still has to show the work. If you're
Yeah.
saying, I independently interpreted all imaging available, but then there's no other documentation of imaging, that that means nothing in the world of data analyzed. You have to show the work. The whole point of that is showing the work. That's
Mhm.
That's really
That's
what
why
it
you get
comes
credit
down
for.
to. Yes,
Yeah.
and I do think, unfortunately, because how it is, misunderstood a lot, there is a lot of missed opportunity in data analyzed as well. We sit here, we talk about our frustrations, but when it comes down to it, there's a lot of work that goes into, especially multiple chronic conditions and things like that, where the provider is having to analyze all this data, and they are doing that work. But because of how it's being presented in the note and such, we just can't give credit for it.
Mhm.
And to me, that's a shame because that is probably what takes the most time, um, in
Well, and
in the
that's a time to
process.
consider time too.
Yes, it
You know,
is.
that's something that I will, depending on specialty I'm working with, talk to them about the fact that, okay, I know there's a lot that goes into what you're doing with the patient here, but as you can see, we have all of these roadblocks that aren't going to give you credit towards the way that the work is being done during the
Mhm.
encounter. So look to time. But it's not, that's a whole other thing. We won't go into that. But,
Yeah,
it's really,
we do not
it's
have enough
really
time.
no, it's important into the whole concept and what we said in the very beginning of showing how you're analyzing it and how you're using it. Because
Mhm.
even with that, the last area here for this particular element, the discussion with another healthcare provider, practitioner, professional, whoever, if you are just saying you talked to so and so, or you left a
Yeah,
voicemail, or you sent an email or a
or
text.
you plan to speak with them.
Yes. Yeah, remember the discussion is back and forth. It's not a one-way transmission of information. And we have to be able to see that that's an external discussion that was required in working towards assessing and treating that patient, which is
Mhm.
where we bring in that concept of analyzing.
Yeah, and there needs to be details of that discussion. Why did you have a discussion? Like the other day, I was auditing, and the provider just said discussed with Doctor ABC and Doctor XYZ. Well, what? Why did you discuss it to them? What did you discuss? But then at the same time, there's another provider who's talking about discussions with RT and the
Mhm.
specifics of that. And I'm like, I couldn't have asked for better documentation. And the thing is it literally was a sentence. That's all
Right.
the provider had to do. Like, so I feel like people put in these fillers and these macro statements and these buzzwords when all you need to do is just very briefly tell us what you did
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
why.
don't try to automate it. Don't try to
No,
automate it. We
no.
don't see
And
what's individual.
And I feel like this is a category where the buzzwords are a buzzin',
Mhm.
and they think that they have done something with that when in actuality they have not supported anything by just using that buzzword. And that's why too, like, this is kind of out of the realm of data analyzed, but I know you've seen it. But when providers like to use phrases that come exactly from the
Mhm.
verbiage in the MDM table, it's like, well, today, perfect example, unplanned injection. However, in the HPI, we circle back, it said, patient presented requesting injection. Well, that's not unplanned.
Yeah.
It's like, so they used this buzzword of unplanned injection trying to support the 25 modifier, but in actuality, they ordered an MRI, they prescribed them medication. So they didn't need this buzzword to support their E&M. They
Mhm.
actually did manage the patient outside of this injection. And so, of course, that was in my feedback, but it just was kind of like, oh, I wish people would stop doing that because you have not you have not solidified your medical necessity
Mhm.
by
Yeah, it's
using
just
that.
busy work at that point,
Yep.
which that's the whole gripe in general with documentation and what's needed for coding. But that also shows why it's so important when you have external audits done for your organization. It's
Mhm.
important to do this process on your own, not wait
Yeah.
for a payer to come in and do it, because you can take that, you can simplify it and say, okay, why are you doing this in your documentation? Or maybe that was a medical assistant or a nurse who roomed the
Mhm.
patient and did the intake, and now they've contradicted the last part of the note.
Yeah.
So there's ways to use it to uncomplicate what's going on and be specific to your practice, your workflow. If you own equipment, if you don't own diagnostic equipment, all of those things. But it's not a way to just fix this by adding all of these phrases in and thinking that,
Yeah.
okay, you're good to go now.
Yeah, you have to actually show the work. And those contradictions are going to be picked up on 100%.
Hmm.
Um, Maybe not in the coding side, because, like I said, sometimes the quantity is pushed and, quality can slip as a result of that. But it's going to be noticed whether by somebody doing an external audit that they have asked for or one that they have not.
Hmm. Yep.
And yeah.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate. It really is unfortunate. And, you know, we all kind of shy away from data analyzed, I think, for this exact reason, because we just spent 40 minutes picking apart data analyzed. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. I know.
something that shouldn't be, eh,
That hard.
yeah, but it is. It is
Yeah.
that hard, and you do have to pay that much attention to it. It's not just about checking boxes and counting tests and orders and reviews. You have to dig deeper into that and know what's the source of it, who's billing for it, who billed for it, and go from there. Maybe they said independent interpretation, but does the documentation reflect an independent interpretation, or does it reflect a review of somebody else's report?
Hmm.
um, you know is this test that they're marking as reviewed, did they review it last time? Because probably a good 7 out of 10 times I go back to that last visit, and sure enough, there's that test,
Same
and it's
wording.
reviewed. You don't get to review that every single time and then get credit for that. So you have to do that extra work to get to
Yeah.
the bottom of what's actually supported and what's not.
Yeah. So overall, I would say let this episode be a reminder that you need to nitpick a little more what it is that you're seeing in
Mhm.
that documentation, especially if you're an internal coder or auditor for your organization. You really need to look at that more critically. Don't just say,
Mhm.
oh, I see these things here from the module that were blown in. Let me give credit. Let's look a little closer and
Yeah.
make sure that it's really truly being accounted for.
Well, and one thing that I hear a lot of people say when we have data findings is, well, it's in the note, of course they looked at it, or of course they used it. Remember, unless it's documented, it didn't happen. No assumptions can be made. As frustrating as that is, because these tools are intended to make it easier, no assumption can be made. And
Mhm.
just because it's there doesn't mean it was looked at or used. It means the template pulled it in. That's all that means, in my
Yep.
opinion. And if you're a provider watching this kind of gives you insight into the mind of an auditor and how we're looking at this. And, we want you to get credit for the work that you do. Don't walk away from this saying data analyzed is a lost cause. No, just document it exactly
Mhm.
what you're doing.
Yeah. And really document it knowing what it is that is within the
Yes.
guidelines. Because if
Document
you
with
just,
intention.
yeah, if you just look at the bullet points and you don't read the definitions from AMA, you're not going to understand what it is that we've been talking about. So, all right, we will go ahead and wrap it up there. And I just wanted to quickly say, so I was looking over the analytics for the show recently, and I've noticed we really have grown quite a bit as far as the listeners, the followers, all of that. So, if you are new to listening to us on this podcast, remember to go out and rate the show, rate the different episodes, leave a comment, subscribe, share it, all of those different things that'll definitely help us to continue to grow. And also look for Stephanie Allard Consulting on your favorite social media app. Pretty much everything except I definitely do not do Snapchat, but you can find me
You do
on,
some very riveting TikToks.
yes. I feel very old when I attempt
I'm
these
only picking
TikToks.
on you about
Well, If people knew how long some of the early ones took till I hit post,
Or
you
I'd
would be
I'd have to
laughing
call
pretty
you and
hard.
be like, "Did you mean for that to cut off there?"
Yes, yes. Exactly, exactly. So
I mean,
follow
I
along,
can't
and
say much.
hopefully Michelle has caught those things before you see them. But we do have, a following that's growing on YouTube, TikTok, just started Instagram recently if you like that platform, Facebook, all of that. So
Mhm.
hope to see more of the involvement from the industry. It's been really great hearing everybody's feedback and, how the show's been helping them, all of those things. So let's continue that and follow, subscribe, all the things. And we'll see you back next week.